Welcome to America's Talking. I'm your host, Cole McNeely. Today, we'll be discussing the topic of DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion policies that are occurring across the country in both states and at the federal level that is impacting not only policy, but also professions. And joining me today to discuss this is the Center Square's managing editor, Alan Wooten. Alan, thanks for joining us on America's Talking.
Cole, great to be here. Thanks for inviting me.
And welcome back to the program. He's a regular now. It's a Center Square reporter, Jon Styf. John?
Happy to be here and happy to talk about something that isn't sports bullets, right?
That's right. Opening day right around the corner here. And we also have Carleen Johnson, who is a Center Square reporter out of the state of Washington. Carleen, welcome to America's Talking.
Thank you. Happy to be part of the program today. Bear with my sick voice, but I'll get through with you.
You know, today, as I mentioned, we're discussing DEI policies, legislation, diversity, equity, and inclusion. That's what we're talking about today. John, I want to start with you. Listeners, they see these acronyms. They may have a general idea of what DEI is, what it means. But when we say DEI, what are we talking about?
Well, it's not way different than 20 years ago when we would have called something affirmative action. And essentially, DEI is trying to make sure everyone's represented. And it got big in colleges, and under the Biden administration, it's become an important part of what they have pushed in a lot of things. And especially post-COVID, when there's been a lot of money thrown around to programs, to businesses, to farmers. I mean, they've picked at every category that you can, and they put together rules after there's a large amount of money set aside for something. And often those rules have included prioritizing first that money or that jobs or that something goes to people that fit those different categories that they're looking to fill, rather than just looking at a group of people and saying, hey, this person needs it more. So you're basing everything on someone's race, gender, religion, rather than who the person is, the need, things like that, which, as you can expect, is a constitutional issue.
Yeah, and there's been quite a bit of controversy surrounding these things. And Alan, I want to bring you in on this. We've seen these in different places. We'll get to attorneys and the practice of law in a minute in the state of Washington. But we've seen some DEI policies, practices into the medical field, and there has been some outspoken, I'll call them critics, but people who are concerned about this, DEI initiatives getting into professional spheres, specifically in the medical field.
There have been. Here in North Carolina, there's been reporting by other outlets that show that at Duke University, the surgeons Duke is renowned worldwide medical facility. Surgeons getting chosen because of either color, ethnicity, and that kind of thing. Also, the DEI policies they've gotten into the medical school at UCLA out in California as well. So it is prevalent. Last week, a couple of the House of Representatives in Washington, practicing physicians, Greg Murphy from North Carolina, Brad Winstrup from Ohio, they introduced legislation. The acronym is called the EDUCATE Act. It stands for Embracing Anti-Discrimination, Unbiased Curricula, and Advancing Truth in Education. And what this legislation would do is it would ban race-based mandates at medical schools and accrediting institutions. It's something that they just don't want to see federal dollars going to fuel these things. Dr. Murphy has said many times that, it should be merit. If you look at an NBA player's contract, it's based on how good a player he is. If you're in the military and you want a sniper, you get the guy that's the best shot. Should be the same way if you get a surgeon. One of the fellows who spoke at the press conference last week, Dr. Stanley Goldfarb, he's chairman of Do No Harm. He told the story of a medical student who recently had been with his organization. He says, I've learned more about pronouns than I have about kidney disease. And Dr. Goldfarb said, patients should be terrified about this kind of education.
Yeah, and beyond the medical field, Carleen, in the state of Washington, we have seen the state Supreme Court come out and actually make a decision to eliminate the traditional bar exam for law school students. And we hear the word in this DEI conversation, equity is used a lot. And that was part of the justification that the Washington State Supreme Court used and essentially lowering the bar for the bar exam.
Yeah, they did. Basically got rid of it. There's going to be alternate pathways to prove that, you're going to be a good lawyer when you get out of law school. And, that decision came down March 15th here in the state of Washington by order of the state Supreme Court. Now, this actually goes back to July of 2020, several months into COVID, and the 2-day in-person bar exam for that year's graduating class or that quarter, whatever. They didn't do it. They got rid of it. And I guess everybody then went, oh, well, that's actually pretty good because now everybody passed and, well, it's all good. You guys go on and be lawyers. And then it became an issue of diversity, equity, inclusion. And that's when the state Supreme Court here in Washington created what they call the State Bar Licensure Task Force. And it was made up of a couple of our state Supreme Court justices, attorneys representing groups like the Latino State Bar Association, lots of folks that maybe are marginalized communities. And the whole task of the task force was to look into, basically, it sounds like confirm the notion that the state bar exam disproportionately, unnecessarily blocks marginalized groups from practicing law. And then they cited the fact that, we don't have enough attorneys in the state. And so since people of color, this was the contention actually made in one of the arguments that I watched the live feed of, the state Supreme Court justice said, we know that marginalized communities, people of color, don't test as well on the state bar, which I don't know, some people might take offense to that comment if you were a person of color who has maybe graduated at the top of your law class. But to be told you don't test as well, and we need to encourage more folks of color into the legal profession. That was the notion. That was confirmed at the end of multiple meetings of this licensure task force. They gave all of their study material to the state Supreme Court. And on Friday, March 15th, they said, nope, there's alternate pathways now in lieu of the bar exam to become a licensed attorney in the state of Washington.
And really beyond, okay, we've hit doctors, we hit lawyers. John, you also covered the fact that there are actually whistleblowers coming out about the FBI. So what's going on with the FBI when it comes to DEI hiring practices?
So those FBI former special agents and current came together and put together a report for the U.S. House Judiciary Committee that kind of highlighted trends in DEI hiring rather than merit-based hiring. That came out last fall. Not a lot was done about it. In this spring, West Virginia's Attorney General just sent a letter to the FBI director saying, hey, this needs to stop. We need to start showing transparency in what the hiring practices are for the FBI. And you need to highlight what were the failures that led to hiring that wasn't about who's going to be the best FBI agent and why we're doing that and why we went down that path.
John, one of the interesting things about that is Alan mentioned this earlier. When you want a doctor, you want the best surgeon. When you want an attorney, you probably want the best attorney for the most part. When it comes to FBI agents, what has been the pushback around, I'm saying, I doubt the argument is that, in certain cities, you see this, push for diversity on law enforcement officials because it's the communities of which these people are police officers in, and they think that will tie in better with the community, create better enforcement. There is a theory there behind it that is, at the end of the day, claiming it will enhance enforcement to some degree. When it comes to FBI, are they doing this for the sake of just diversity? Or are they doing it for a pragmatic end, like we've seen in other law enforcement realms?
No, it's for the sake of diversity, and it's part of that federal push for diversity, and it wasn't done for the reasons that you're talking about. And the FBI obviously operates different than a local police force. You're not doing community policing. You're not doing those daily interactions with the community. The FBI does higher level work than that.
And Alan, we're seeing concerns about federal involvement in DEI, pushing hiring policies. What is the next steps around this? This feels like both a taxpayer concern meets a cultural issue, and it feels like it could get really messy when it comes to actual policy coming down, particularly from a federal level, potentially across either federal departments, all 50 states. What does this actually look like in the next year or two here, if this is going to be a major part of an election year potentially, combined with potentially a major part of a Biden administration if his administration gets reelected? What do you expect to see?
Well, I would take your notion a step further and say it's already messy. It's already messy in a lot of different areas. I wanted to follow one of Carleen's points, talking about folks that don't test well and everything. In the presser that I attended on this side of the country, they were talking about one of the questions for the representatives was about enough blacks becoming doctors and that kind of thing. And why don't they? And one of the non-doctors, in fact, I think he was the only non-doctor who actually spoke there, was Representative Burgess Owens, 1980 Oakland Raiders Super Bowl champion. And Burgess is black. And Burgess told him, he says, this starts in K through 12. We've got to teach kids to read. That's the problem. We don't have kids, learning what they need to learn coming up. And then that's why, to Carleen's point, that's probably why they're not testing well. They don't read very well. So that was mentioned in there. And then there was also the notion that you can get a better medical outcome if the doctors you're dealing with look more like you, which goes towards a little bit of what Jon was alluding to with community policing. Communities want DEI practices so that the police force is reflective of the community that they're policing over. I don't know. When I get on a plane, I want the best pilot. When I go to the doctor, I want the best surgeon. It is, to answer your question, it is a part of what we're seeing in this election cycle. It's not the top of the list, but it is in the election cycle. There are people who are more of the merit base really goes with the free market thinking. If you earn it, great. Everybody should be able to get everything they want. And it's inclusive of everybody. It's not exclusive. And that's one of the biggest things that I'm seeing. I think it was Dr. Winstrup at the press conference said, he said, I looked up the word equity. I said, and it doesn't mean that you exclude. You welcome everybody. And I think that's something that's very important to be remembered as we talk about diversity, equity, and inclusion. Are you really excluding or are you really including? And I think that's one of the things that those with clearer minds and a little bit more in the middle are going to look at and determine for themselves, and especially when they go to the ballot box in November, too.
And Carleen, Alan kind of spoke to this on national level, federal level, however you want to look at this. Washington is a very progressive state. You hear a lot of other policies coming out of the state of Washington, where Washington is one of the first states to adopt these policies. When it comes to DEI policies, where does that go? Because we're at the front end of this entire discussion for the most part.
And it's already, you referenced it being, an ugly fight, messy fight. It has been here for years. And finally here in Washington state, where, yes, the western half of the state is very blue. The eastern half of the state is very red. Right in the middle, there's a little purple. But we have had this conversation for years. And this year was the first time citizen initiative, then it went to the legislature, something called the Parents' Bill of Rights was passed. State lawmakers were forced to, majority Democrats, of course, in control, both chambers and the governor's mansion. But there was so much pressure coming from the public to say, hey, wait a minute. You're teaching my kid gender pronouns, or my kid went to school and said, Mr. Jones, call me they, them now. And you don't have to tell me. There was so much outrage here from both sides of the aisle that initiative went to the legislature, one of 6 this year that went. The other 3 are going to be on the ballot. 3 ended up getting passed by state lawmakers because of such great amount of pressure. But on top of that, so now you got the Parents' Bill of Rights saying, tell me what's happening with my kid, right? But lawmakers at the same time passed a new bill this year that says the state Office of Superintendent of Public Instruction, Chris Rakedall, kind of positions himself to be more centrist. Many would argue that a lot of the policies coming out of OSPI are very left-leaning. But he now has to approve and promote culturally representative materials. And no school district, no matter where they are in the state, can refuse to adopt the OSPI curriculum. The state now has central control over how all of the school districts, all 295 of them in the state of Washington, the curriculum they will have no say in. OSPI has that. So there's a bitter, ugly fight that's not over here in the state on this stuff.
Jon, beyond the cultural aspect of, Billy thinks this is okay, Susie doesn't think it's okay, sit that aside. There are legal issues potentially coming with some of these DEI practices. We're actually seeing this with the Department of Labor's a rule that's prioritizing DEI and internship program funding. What's going on there?
Right. The state of Tennessee, the Attorney General joined up with 24 other attorneys general and essentially told the Department of Labor, we're going to fight this, and you can't prioritize programs that prioritize DEI. And one of the interesting parts of that legal argument is that it's the same laws that were pushed for so long and pushed for to give equal rights to everyone that are the reason that you can't do those things. The Equal Protection Clause, there's civil rights laws, there's Title VII, and the U.S. Supreme Court said what cannot be done directly also cannot be done indirectly. And that's the attempt of a lot of these programs, is to indirectly boost different groups and to be able to get more grants, get more funding. And these are all federal taxpayer dollars, and it creates an unequal playing field. And you simply can't do that. There's plenty of federal laws that have been put in place that don't allow for unfair treatment of anyone.
And Alan, you're the most seasoned journalist here. I'll put it that way. And Alan, Jon mentioned the precedent of sort that is being faced here of past civil rights laws, cultural beliefs that are at odds from a legal perspective from this. For these DEI policies, this seems like a situation where there is an attempt by advocates. There is a belief that they're righting wrongs of sorts, or an attempt to right a wrong. Now, it gets to the question, as Jon mentioned, which is if you are attempting to right the wrong in a way that is based on preferential hiring, based upon, I would think fair to say, characteristics that would usually be considered unfair. And what I mean by that is race, sex, gender identity. If people were excluded because of those things, that would be seen as unjust. But to include them because of those things, you're excluding others, which seems at odds with the idea of equality. But again, it goes back to this word of equity. Equity. This is the big thing. In former discussions around civil rights movements, it has been largely around this idea of equality. Now this has shifted to equity. Where do you see the biggest difference between those two, just from purely a journalist standpoint?
Well, to your point, I was on the tail end of the baby boom, and I have seen when I started first grade, it was the beginning of integration in the community that I was in here in the South. And so I do remember the time before Title IX, and I remember what Title IX did for women, the opportunities it gave them. I've interviewed and talked to many who were impacted by it, both before and after. And I see what's going on. That's different than DEI, but it is a deal with inclusion And that's going on at the same time with Save Women's Sports. So the biggest difference that I see right now is a lot of the gains don't seem to be enough for a segment of people. There seems to be wanting more. And so now there's as John said, there's an indirect way of trying to get that. The Supreme Court rulings last summer against Harvard and the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill are prime examples. Affirmative action was struck down. But what you're seeing with the policies of diversity, equity, and inclusion is a way to essentially do about the same thing. And it's not so much about opportunity for everyone and including everyone. It's about promoting someone at someone else's expense. And to me, that's the rub. Back in the 60s and 70s, I didn't see it. I was young, but I didn't see it coming out that way. I saw it as everyone gets the same opportunity. Everyone gets the same level playing field. Now I'm seeing it's not necessarily got to be the same level playing field. Those who believe in the merit-based system, as the representatives I watched last week do, they will tell you that's not a good route. To your earlier question of when does it get to be too much, the doctor said last week, people are going to die because they're not going to have the best surgeons. It's the same thing with, I don't know, if you fly a lot and you don't have the best pilot, then yeah, there's a risk there. There's a risk in whatever it is, whether it's a bus driver or an airplane pilot or anything else. If it's someone who's with our FBI, then yeah, there's a security issue there. But you want to have the best people, and merit-based is what a lot of folks believe in.
I was just going to piggyback off something that Alan said a few minutes back. Med school. My niece and goddaughter is currently a third-year med school student, kind of doing some different rotations all over the state. Well, they recently told her that in this next testing, this constantly testing to make sure you're up on your skills and everything, right? That instead of being a score for her test, this is going to be a pass-fail. Now, when you're talking about the best surgeon, the best, I'm a cancer survivor. If I'd gone in there and gone, okay, how did you do in med school? How'd you do when you finished, you decide you wanted to cure people of cancer, help people through their cancer journey? Well, I did okay. I passed. I don't think anybody wants that. You want the best oncologist to try to save your life. You want the best students graduating at the top of their class in med school, getting those opportunities to work in hospitals where they're desperately in need of the best of the best.
And Alan, you mentioned the idea of a meritocracy earlier, and it is said that maybe the last standing meritocracy in the world is professional sports for the most part. And I think there are plenty of questions as to whether or not the world should operate in the cutthroat fashion of a professional sports environment. I'll say from my perspective, coming from a athletic background, coming from a sports family, the idea of a meritocracy was very much ingrained in me. And then when you actually partake in those things, it's acted out. And there are biases left and right. And you see that all the time. The coach's kid is getting preferential treatment. We see this all the time. And I mean, we speak of a lack of meritocracy when it comes to admissions into colleges. My grandfather went to Harvard, and so you get preferential treatment coming in. So there are a lot of areas in the United States and academia particularly where meritocracy has historically been set aside.
Yeah, well, I mean, we've talked about the merit-based, and, the representatives last week mentioned that too, but there are so many things across America that, merit isn't a big part of it. There are ways to be included. There are ways to participate. And some of those, before the civil rights movement, before, if you even go back before women's suffrage, things like that, there are a lot of places where there is inclusion now. And what we've discussed today in no way takes away from that point, and it shouldn't be lost on people. But there are, to the point that we're talking about with DEI, there are a lot of places where they're trying to top down force it. And there's some places where that may not be a good idea.
As Alan mentioned, there are a litany of things culturally, economically, professionally that aren't meritocracies. And I do wonder, not even wonder, I believe that the advocates of these DEI policies believe that the policies are necessary for addressing essentially the sins of the past that have rippling effects to today. I think that is a fair way to frame it, and that is the place these policies are coming from. But it is a fascinating paradox to have those side by side contradicting legal rulings of civil rights movements of the past, expectations, precedents of the past. That is the heart of the issue and will be the heart of the legal and cultural issues moving forward of people even who may believe in the ideals of DEI, that from a policy aspect, there could be questionable precedents set that could lead to unforeseen impacts down the road. Listeners, you can read all these stories and more at thecentersquare.com. I want to thank Alan, Jon, and Carleen for joining us today. If you enjoyed this podcast, hit that subscribe button and check out all the episodes on americastalking.com. I'm Cole McNeely, and thanks for listening to America's Talking. Knowledge is power, and you deserve to know what happens in your state government. That's why the Center Square's reporting zeroes in on state authorities publishing stories that show where your money goes and who spends it. The Center Square gives power to the taxpayer by tracking politicians' use of the people's money and demanding transparency from state-run agencies. This is how the Center Square equips you, the American taxpayer, to hold your state government accountable. Sign up now for your state's Center Square newsletter at thecentersquare.com.